Right now, as you watch this, Ukrainian forces are pushing into territory that Russia claimed was permanently theirs. Not a border skirmish, not a probe, a deliberate, coordinated thrust into positions that Moscow spent months fortifying. And the world barely noticed. That changes today. This isn't just another chapter in a war that has already consumed too many headlines. This is an inflection point, a moment where the momentum that has defined this conflict for months is genuinely in question. For the past year, you've heard about Russian advances, Ukrainian defensive stands, grinding positional warfare that drains both sides dry. But now the picture is shifting. Ukraine is on the move, and the implications stretch far beyond the battlefield. So why should you care? Because this conflict isn't happening in isolation. The price you pay at the pump, the security guarantees your country maintains, the stability of the global economy, the precedent being set for how territorial disputes are resolved anywhere on Earth, these all connect to what is happening in those fields right now. When frontlines shift, supply chains shift. When alliances strain, trade agreements strain. When a major nuclear power commits its military to a prolonged engagement, every nation recalculates its own defense posture. You don't have to be a policy expert to feel these ripples. You just have to pay attention. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is happening on the ground, why these counterattacks matter strategically, what this means for the broader geopolitical landscape, and what specific developments to watch for in the coming days and weeks. This is your briefing, and it starts right now. To understand why these Ukrainian counterattacks matter, you need to understand how the front lines have looked for the better part of a year. Russia has been conducting what military analysts call a breadth-over-depth strategy. Instead of pushing for rapid breakthroughs, they have been grinding forward across a wide front, using artillery fire and infantry waves to slowly erode Ukrainian defenses. It is not a glamorous approach. It is not the lightning advance that Russia originally promised. But it has been effective in occupying territory, even if that territory often amounts to bombed-out villages and cratered fields. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been playing a patient defense while preparing something else entirely. Western military advisors have been working with Ukrainian commanders to plan what you might call a systematic disruption strategy. Instead of trying to match Russia tank for tank, Ukraine has been targeting Russian supply lines, command centers, and the logistics networks that keep their frontline forces supplied. The goal was never to hold every inch. The goal was to degrade Russia's ability to sustain their offensive long enough to create an opening. And that opening appears to be opening now. The specific counterattacks we are seeing involve Ukrainian units pushing into areas that Russia has controlled for months, sometimes nearly a year. These aren't desperate last stands. These are coordinated operations involving armor, infantry, and engineering units working together to breach Russian defensive lines. Videos circulating among military analysts show Ukrainian forces advancing through contested territory, establishing new positions, and crucially, holding them. That last point matters more than you might think. In this war, holding ground against Russian counterattacks has been one of the hardest things to do. Ukraine is doing it. Here is what makes this particularly significant. Russian forces have been reinforced by newly mobilized troops, men called up in the autumn of 2022, in one of Russia's most controversial domestic decisions. Those reinforcements have been used to plug gaps and maintain defensive lines across hundreds of kilometers of frontage. But there are limits to what numbers alone can accomplish. Without adequate equipment, without proper training, and without clear command direction, newly mobilized troops can become liabilities rather than assets. Ukrainian intelligence appears to have identified exactly these weaknesses. The counterattacks we are seeing target those seams, the points where hastily assembled Russian units meet the boundary between different command zones. This is the military equivalent of finding the loose brick in someone else's wall and pushing on it until the whole structure starts to crack. It is methodical, it is calculated, and it is producing results that have surprised even optimistic Ukrainian supporters. Now, if you are finding this breakdown useful, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We track these developments in real time, and the next update could change the entire picture. The situation on the ground is fluid in a way that rarely stays static for more than a few hours. What you learn today could be incomplete by tomorrow, and staying connected means staying ahead of the curve. We don't just report what happened, we explain what it means and what comes next. Now let's go deeper into what's really driving this crisis, because the military picture is only part of the story. Russia is not just fighting with its army, it is fighting with its economy, its political system, and its international relationships. Understanding these pressures helps explain why the battlefield shifts matter so much in the broader context. Consider the economic dimension. Russia has been hit by unprecedented Western sanctions, restrictions that target its banking sector, its technology imports, and its energy revenues. Energy exports, particularly natural gas and oil, have been Russia's financial lifeblood for decades. But the sanctions, combined with the mysterious damage to the Nord Stream pipelines that connect Russian gas to Germany, have dramatically reduced Europe's reliance on Russian energy. European countries have been scrambling to secure alternative supplies, building liquefied natural gas terminals, negotiating with other producers, and accelerating their transition to renewable energy. The result? Russia's energy revenues, which fund its military operations, have dropped significantly. When energy market analysts look at the numbers, they see Russia earning roughly 40% less from energy exports compared to before the war. That is not an abstract figure. That means fewer resources for weapons, fewer resources for soldier pay, fewer resources for the equipment needed to sustain an extended campaign. This financial pressure is building on a military that has already suffered enormous casualties. How enormous? Independent analysts estimate that Russia has lost somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 casualties, a figure that includes both killed and wounded. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the equivalent of losing the entire active-duty military of a mid-sized NATO country, completely eliminated over the course of about 18 months. The Russian government has tried to control information about these losses, classifying casualty data and cracking down on independent reporting. But the scale is impossible to hide completely. Families are mourning, memorial sites are growing, and the pressure on the Kremlin to show results, to demonstrate that the sacrifice has meaning, is mounting every week. This creates a fascinating but terrible dynamic. Russia cannot afford to lose, but it also cannot afford to win slowly. Its economy is under strain. Its population is being asked to bear sacrifices that go beyond what even authoritarian governments can sustain indefinitely. And the longer the war drags on, the more these pressures compound. But here is the part that most analysts are underemphasizing. Russia still has significant assets. It still controls enormous territory, including Crimea, which it seized in 2014. It still has a large nuclear arsenal that deters direct NATO intervention. It still has allies, albeit reluctant ones, who provide diplomatic cover and some economic cooperation. And it still has the ability to launch massive missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, attacks that have caused widespread power outages and humanitarian suffering throughout the winter. Ukraine, for its part, is running on fumes and foreign support. Western military aid has been crucial, but it has also been unpredictable. Political debates in the United States and Europe have created uncertainty about whether the next package of weapons will arrive on time, whether the next financial support payment will be approved. Ukraine has shown remarkable resilience, but resilience requires resources, and resources require consistency. This is why the current counterattacks carry significance beyond their immediate tactical value. They demonstrate that Ukraine can still take the initiative, that it can still punch through Russian defenses when conditions are right. That matters enormously for the political calculation in Western capitals. When lawmakers ask whether continued support for Ukraine makes sense, the answer depends partly on whether Ukraine is making progress or simply defending fixed lines indefinitely. Right now, Ukraine is making progress. That changes the math. But what does this mean for ordinary people? For the farmer in eastern Ukraine whose fields have become a battlefield? For the family in Kharkiv whose apartment building was damaged by a Russian missile? For the soldier on both sides who wakes up every morning not knowing if they will survive until evening? This is where the abstraction of geopolitics becomes human tragedy. The frontlines shifting is not just a military event. It is a cascade of individual decisions, individual sacrifices, individual losses. In the villages where these counterattacks are happening, residents who fled months ago are watching news reports with a mixture of hope and fear. Some are already trying to return, drawn by the possibility that their homes might be safe again. Others remain skeptical, having seen previous advances reversed in the punishing back and forth of this conflict. The emotional weight of these decisions, the hope and the doubt, is something that cannot be captured in casualty counts or territorial maps. What would you do if you were in their position? Would you trust that the advance will hold? Would you wait for more confirmation? The people living through this don't have the luxury of waiting for complete information. They have to decide with uncertainty, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of suffering. Now let's talk about what this means for the broader international system. When analysts look at conflicts like this one, they often focus on what happens in the immediate term. But the ripple effects extend years, even decades into the future. What we are witnessing is not just a war between two countries. It is a reordering of how major powers think about security, alliances, and the use of military force. Consider Germany's transformation. Before February 2022, Germany was famously reluctant to provide weapons to conflict zones, famously dependent on Russian natural gas, famously committed to a post-military identity that its leaders described as civilian power. That identity is gone. Germany now spends more on defense than at any point since World War II. It has sent heavy weapons to Ukraine, including Leopard tanks that Berlin would never have approved before the invasion. It has reoriented its energy policy completely, building terminals for liquefied natural gas and extending the life of its remaining nuclear plants. This shift didn't happen because German politicians woke up one morning and decided to change course. It happened because the invasion demonstrated that the security assumptions Germany had built its post-war identity around were simply incorrect. A similar transformation is happening across NATO. The alliance that many declared brain dead just a few years ago has found new purpose. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral, have applied for membership and begun integration into NATO structures. The alliance has conducted exercises in the Baltic region and the Balkans that would have seemed implausible before the invasion. And member countries have agreed to increase defense spending, with most NATO members now meeting the 2% of GDP target that the alliance has long requested. This is a fundamental shift in European security architecture, and it has been driven by a single event: Russia's decision to launch a full-scale invasion of its neighbor. But here is the complication. While NATO has strengthened in some dimensions, it has also faced strains. The debate over weapons supplies to Ukraine has created friction between countries that want to do more and countries that worry about escalation. Hungary, for example, has repeatedly blocked EU sanctions packages and maintained closer ties with Moscow than other EU members find comfortable. The political right in several European countries has shown sympathy for Russian positions, creating strange bedfellows between anti-establishment movements and pro-Russian outlooks. And the economic pain of the war, while manageable so far, has begun to bite in ways that could erode public support for continued assistance. The question of the next 6 months is whether these internal tensions remain manageable or whether they break open. European unity has been remarkable, but unity is easier to maintain when the crisis is clearly escalating. If the frontlines stabilize and the war becomes a grinding stalemate, the political pressure for a negotiated settlement will grow. That pressure could force concessions that neither side wants, or it could simply fracture the Western coalition that has supported Ukraine so far. Does this change how you see the conflict? Does it make you think about which outcomes are actually achievable versus which ones sound good in a press release but fall apart on the ground? Here is a concrete example of what I mean. Crimea, the peninsula that Russia seized in 2014, has been a stated Ukrainian objective since the invasion began. Ukraine has repeatedly insisted that it will not accept any peace deal Chinese letter Russian control of Crimea. But military analysts who study the terrain understand that Crimea is extremely difficult to retake by force. The land bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine is heavily fortified. The Kerch Bridge, Russia's main supply line to Crimea, has been attacked but remains operational. And Crimea itself is populated largely by people who have lived under Russian administration for nearly a decade, people whose allegiances are complicated, and whose views cannot be simply overridden by military force. This doesn't mean Ukraine is wrong to pursue its stated objectives. It means that the gap between political aspirations and military reality is enormous. And bridging that gap requires resources, time, and luck that no one can guarantee. Understanding this gap is essential for thinking clearly about what outcomes are actually possible. Share your perspective in the comments below. Do you think Western support for Ukraine will remain strong enough to change the battlefield dynamics, or do you see a different path emerging? Your perspective helps us all understand this faster. We read every comment, and your insights regularly shape how we approach these topics. The community here has been one of the most valuable parts of this coverage, and we want to keep that energy going. While you are thinking about that, consider this next piece of the puzzle. The counterattacks we are seeing now are not isolated events. They are the product of months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and logistics planning. Ukraine has been working with Western partners to identify weak points in Russian defenses, to coordinate timing with the arrival of new equipment, and to manage the rotation of units so that advances can be sustained without exhausting the troops doing the fighting. This level of coordination requires trust, communication, and shared objectives. It also requires Ukraine to make difficult choices about where to commit its limited resources. Every unit sent to the front in one area is a unit not available for another. Every weapon system deployed in one sector is a system not available for another. The Ukrainian command has to manage these trade-offs constantly, and the fact that they are achieving results suggests that this management is working, at least so far. But the pressure is not decreasing. Russia is adapting. Russian commanders are learning from their mistakes, adjusting tactics, and bringing in new units to replace those that have been attrited. The drone and missile campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure has not stopped, even as Ukrainian forces advance on other parts of the front. And the political clock in Western capitals continues ticking, with elections and budget cycles creating windows of uncertainty that both sides have to plan around. So what happens next? Let me outline 3 scenarios, each with different triggers and different implications for how this conflict evolves. The most likely outcome, in the view of most military analysts I have reviewed, is a continuation of the current grinding dynamics with periods of Ukrainian advance, followed by Russian consolidation, followed by another Ukrainian advance. Think of it like a tide coming in and going out, but over months rather than hours. Ukraine will take some territory, Russia will respond by reinforcing those areas, and the front lines will stabilize again until another opportunity emerges. This scenario assumes that Western support remains roughly constant, and that neither side achieves a dramatic technological breakthrough that shifts the balance decisively. The worst-case scenario is one where Russian mobilization finally produces results, where the hundreds of thousands of men called up in 2022 are adequately trained, equipped, and led. If that happens, Russia could launch its own counteroffensive that recaptures territory and potentially threatens Ukrainian cities. This would put enormous pressure on Ukraine's Western partners to escalate their support, potentially including more advanced weapon systems, intelligence sharing, or even direct intervention. The risk of miscalculation in such a scenario would be enormous, and the consequences of miscalculation could extend far beyond Ukraine. The wildcard scenario is one that nobody is talking about enough. That is the possibility of internal instability in Russia itself. President Putin's government has maintained control through a combination of repression, propaganda, and genuine popular support for nationalist objectives. But as casualties mount and economic conditions deteriorate, the pressures on this system will grow. Military failures, which are becoming harder to hide as videos circulate and soldiers return home wounded, could undermine the regime's narrative that the special military operation is going according to plan. If that narrative breaks, the political consequences could be unpredictable and potentially transformative. Here is what to monitor in the news this week. First, watch for reports of Ukrainian forces establishing consolidated positions in newly gained territory. The difference between a probe and a breakthrough is whether the gains are held. Second, watch for Russian responses, not just military but political. Are there signs of mobilization of reserves? Are there signals from Moscow about how they plan to respond? Third, watch for Western diplomatic activity. Is there movement on peace negotiations? Are there back-channel communications that might indicate a shift in either side's willingness to compromise? These 3 indicators will tell you more about the trajectory of this conflict than any sin. Glee Battle Report. The truth is, we are living through a historical inflection point, and the consequences of what happens in the next few months will echo for decades. The world order that emerged from the Cold War is being stress-tested in real time. The assumptions that guided European security for a generation are being rewritten. The balance of power in Eurasia is shifting in ways that will define the strategic environment for your children and grandchildren. But here is the thing, you don't have to feel helpless about this. Understanding what is happening is itself a form of power. It allows you to cut through the noise, to see what is real and what is spin, to make informed judgments about what you believe and what you support. You don't need to be a general or a diplomat to have a stake in this conversation. You just need to pay attention and think critically about what you see. Ukraine is counterattacking. Frontlines are shifting. The momentum that has defined this war is genuinely in question for the first time in months. What happens next will be determined by decisions made in command posts and capitals, but those decisions will be shaped by the context that people like you create when you engage with this topic seriously. Stay informed, stay skeptical of simple answers, stay connected to what is actually happening. That is how you become part of the solution rather than a passive observer of someone else's problem. We will be watching these developments closely, and we will bring you updates as the situation evolves. Subscribe for our next deep dive. We are already tracking the next development, and it could change everything.